Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Barberena, and I am the moderator for this exciting panel that I'm so happy to be a part of. I just want to thank Dr. Maggie Rivas Rodriguez for inviting me and for really hosting this incredible conference. It's, I don't know how to say it, pero híjole, me da tanto orgullo. Like, I'm walking through the halls and I see these amazing scholars, and I'm just so proud to be here, and thank you for the work that you and Dr. Leal have done. It's just fabulous. So. We have some very exciting panels to hear. We're going to cover kind of a gamut of topics, everything from insurgent organizing to Latino voter rights to the news after cities redistricting. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to give each panelist an opportunity to present their papers. We'll allow for like 20 minutes or so. And then afterwards, hopefully we'll have time for, I really want to have time for a Q&A, because I think that's what makes these conferences the most beneficial, for an opportunity to engage in a dialogue and exchange ideas. So we're going to get started. I'm going to just do a brief introduction and ask them to kind of give us a little bit of further introduction. And we're going to start with Joseph Garcia. He's a visiting assistant professor of Chicano Studies at the University of New Mexico. Let's give him a warm welcome. Thank you so much.
I'm going to stand up.
Yeah.
Well, this is kind of intimidating. I'm actually a Cuban-Mexican revolutionary specialist, and I was just in Havana at the first international symposium on the Cuban Revolution. And in one of my presentations, there was all these comandantes, some who had been with Fidel and the Sierra Maestra, and I feel like I'm in the same presence. Ángel Gutierrez and other people who have been in the vanguardia of voting rights. And so, this is kind of another one of those situations. And fortunately, the comandantes were very kind and very, very nice to myself and the other panelists. And it was the first international symposium on the Cuban Revolution, origin and historic development. And I was honored that I was accepted to go there. So I was just there about 3 weeks ago. But this is a paper that I wrote about 10 years ago for a community regional planning program, land use planning. And this had stayed in the back of my mind. This is kind of my oral history and a little bit of my mother's oral history, because I was a teenager and so was my brother. And my parents started organizing in Taft in the late 70s, early 80s. And part of the whole movement that was going on around this that I wasn't even aware of, I just thought this was happening in Taft. I was 12, 13, 14 years old. And the reason I call it insurgent organizing is because my father was this is my parents, in 1969. My father's straight out of Vietnam. He's a veteran of the Battle of Hue. He survived a bullet wound to the forehead in one of the fights. And I started my paper with a poem about him in honor of him and what the bullet that could not kill, and how he knew his life he had a serious life, and he died at the age of 40 of leukemia that I connect to Agent Orange, because he was in some of the thickest fighting in 67, 68 as a recon Marine. And this is my mother, who's here in the audience, and together they were able to bring together an interesting, connection. My father with his military training and coming back to be pelted by rocks and eggs in San Diego, California, to be brutalized by white supremacists in South Texas, and my mother from the community of Taft. My father's originally from Beeville, Texas. And this is kind of also a Texas history, because my mother's father was from Laredo, and he was a bootlegger and a draft dodger. And his brother-in-law was a Texas Ranger who became one of the first border patrolmen, James Rumsey, who was killed in 1922. And they had an arrangement, I think. That's what the oral history of my mother has talked about. And so the other component also is that my mom's family is from Cotula. My abuela, Jacinta Inclán, is from Cotula. And the Inclanes, I think, still work for the LBJ ranch to this day. And LBJ taught some of the Inclanes in Cotula. So that's the other bigger connection. And so what I'm trying to do here is what you see is look at race, ethnicity, gender, transform political consciousness of individuals and local communities. And this is, Al Kaufman was here, and I spoke to him a couple of years ago, and he said, how Taft was the smallest community that they'd ever done a voting rights case. And then Dr. Rivas Rodriguez was kind enough to tell me yesterday that a history of my father that I didn't know, that I think was an oral history with Jose Gatza, and who said that my dad was insistent that they go down there, and that I forget what lawyer, sorry?
They wanted Malden to go.
Exactly. My father wanted Malden to go down there and was insistent, and they showed up. and the lawyer was taunted by the city council, which is all white. And I never forget that, because I'm a teenager or even younger, and we're approaching the city council. My parents took me and my brother to all the meetings. We also consulted with Frederick Cervantes from Corpus Christi State University, and graduate students were coming around. It was quite an interesting experience. And so looking at the case itself and its connection to the Chicano movement, how do voting rights struggle in Taft reflect the larger national political interest? How do the struggles impact personal, social, and political trajectory of individuals and families? How do the stories and accounts of family organizing shape our understanding of legal battles and victories? And so this is my father, and this is from the Corpus Christi Pilot Times back in 1984. And they knew that they couldn't win in the at-large gerrymandered system, and so they started with school board elections. And the reason I say the bullet could not kill, because, of course, as I said earlier, the bullet wound my father sustained and survived to the forehead, and as well as being shot a second time, and who knows what other experiences he had in Vietnam. And the other interesting component is that my parents we lived in Missouri, we lived in Germany for a year. My father spoke several languages. My father worked for Reynolds Aluminum. So we saw the world a little bit, and came back to Taft in 1975, and stumbled into this community that my mother was born and raised in. And just a little bit about the community itself. It's a small farming community. Another important thing is that it's really close to one of the largest lynchings, if not the largest lynching of Mexicans in the 1870s, and near the Nueces River. And these are lands. This is originally the Taft Ranch, the brother of William Howard Taft. It's parceled out to Euro-Americans. I worked harvesting cotton in the 80s for Polish, German, Czech farmers. And so it's an interesting situation. And the south side of the city is a Mexican-American, and the east side is an African-American, Mexican-American work camp, basically, that becomes these barrios, or these neighborhoods. And it's extremely wealthy farmers. One farmer is, I've been told, is a billionaire because of the oil and gas that's getting pumped out of Dilley, Texas, where he owns a considerable amount of land, as well as in Taft. And so there's some interesting dynamics there. And then the mobilization of the community, and I look at it from a larger international national historical context, looking at the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement, the Mexican, Cuban, and Vietnam revolutions. My father came back from Vietnam, and he didn't hate the Vietnamese. He respected them. He studied the Vietnam War, and then how that contributed to him being fearless in terms of being this veteran who came back, and he actually started organizing the VFW, joined the GI Forum, joined LULAC, the NAACP, and was at one point, as he told me, threatened by the white community or elements of the white community that they would take him out or something of that nature. And he said, "Well, go ahead and do that, but you touch my family or my community, I am extremely well trained, and I know I have a group of friends, VFW here, who are extremely well trained, and we'll find you and we'll take you out. And I'm not afraid to lose anything from that." And so what they started doing is they started analyzing the community and started looking at some of the issues. And then also, I pay respects to people in the room. Dr. Hector Garcia, or not Dr. Hector Garcia, but Dr. Josangui Gutierrez. Who I look at Dr. Hector Garcia and Josangui Gutierrez as sons of the Mexican Revolution. And I look at the angle of the Mexican Revolution and the influence of Chicano movement and things of that nature, not necessarily the other aspect of what happened within the United States, which is connected to my dissertation, which is on the Mexican Revolution, and specifically Lázaro Cárdenas. And then also looking at how I had the honor in New Mexico, as president of the graduate students at the University of New Mexico, of awarding Frank Sanchez, who won a voting rights case in 1982, as well as Vicente Jimenez, who organized with the GI Forum, of awarding them honorary PhDs to the University of New Mexico, and I sat on the committee to do that, and I felt honored, and it's kind of like coming full circle in terms of the experience, as well as meeting Al Kaufman a couple of years ago and being there to see him honored at Our Lady of the Lake University for his work. And I did get to meet Hector Garcia because the GI Forum in 1987, 1986, my mom can correct me, honored my father and the plaintiffs of the Garcia versus the City of Taft case. So that's why I have Dr. Garcia out there, and of course the work that he did during his lifetime. And of course, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. And kind of just rehashing a little bit more in terms of getting more in depth in the organizing in terms of the civil rights movement, Vietnam, of course, but then also these attitudes of defending freedom and liberty and returning to this classist, racist, sexist society, and veterans, sacrifice not being counted by all these elites. There was all these ranchers there and farmers were on the city council, but none of them had not done any service, any military service. They're extremely wealthy, very well educated, but they didn't see the Mexicanos in the community as being an asset or have sacrificing anything to the community. And I think that still exists to this day. If not, it's probably worse. And the other thing is a combination of my father's military training, the other people in the community, as well as the Mexican Catholic Church and organizing in the community. My parents went to the Cursillo movement or to Cursillo workshops. And I think also the combination of liberation theology and Vatican II. We had an Irish priest who was very influential in terms of my father. My father did suffer from TBI and PTSD and had, found alternative ways to medicate himself to deal with these issues. And it was because of my mother and the community that she was from and the extended network that I think a lot of Latino, Mexican-American veterans are lucky because that is a form of therapy. And because my mother didn't want to leave the city, my father decided to start organizing and he built a business. Him and the Irish priest, Father Letty, they built a parish hall, and then this built up into political organizing. And so the convolution or the coming together, of these different interests and these different examples. And of course, my father being a part of these different organizations, to a certain extent not outside of tact, and then them being involved in elections. My father was a big, huge Carlos Tran fan and helped get Carlos Tran elected. I think he was the first senator from Kingsville, Chicano senator or Mexican-American senator elected. I'm kind of repeating here. Let's see. And then this is an important piece of it that kind of gave them the impetus. My father at first runs for school board and loses, but then realizes that he needs to run as a slate. And so you have 4 Chicanos that run as a slate, and they transform an almost all-white school board to a more balanced school board. And then looking at the case itself, Al Kaufman, when I talked to him a couple of years ago, told me that the Taft case is really significant because it's the smallest community that they ever took to court. And as Dr. Rivas Rodriguez was saying, that they didn't really want to take it to court, so to speak, but because the lawyer was taunted, it seems to be the case that the ego of Maldef and the attorneys that were involved was a bit challenged. And so the other thing is that, as I said before going to these meetings on separate occasions, and the attitudes of these farmers, and them rejecting, proposals to take this little town and divide it into 2 single-member districts. But still, half of the Mexican barrio was still out of the jurisdiction of the city limits and not allowed to vote. But they were allowed to get city services to a certain extent, but not allowed to vote in the city elections. And it's to this day. Nearly the entire barrio was put into the city, and then it was moved out through elections and fear tactics of telling the people from the barrio that their taxes are going to increase. But the other component is the natural resource or kind of city services aspect of it, in the sense that my parents were also dealing with a community that a large part of the barrio didn't have sewage, didn't have running water. There was a whites-only swimming pool that this case ended, which later on was found to be stealing and was completely funded by the city municipal services, as well as businesses and farmers in the area were stealing or pretty much legally taking water and other resources from the city utilities and making huge profit off of that. And so that's the other component in terms of my own experience of being a Peace Corps volunteer in South America, and how that experience was also about providing natural resources or resources and sewage to a far off community in the middle of South America, where I worked on a municipal running water project through the World Bank with the Paraguayan government. And we laid out 17 kilometers of piping and a whole complete municipal water system. And the challenges I dealt with doing that and coming back, reminding me of the experience of growing up in Taft and what my parents were doing and how that affected my experience in the Peace Corps. Thank you. And so this is just a quick little map of Taft and the way that it was, with the final decision in 1989, was split into 2 districts. This is still all mostly barrio here that is still to this day out. It was brought into city limits about maybe 10 years ago, but then the folks voted again. On the other side, where number 2 is a predominantly white, very wealthy farmers to this day, although it's been integrated a lot more. And since the case, there's been white flight to Corpus Christi and to the nearest town. And Texas, Taft is nearly all Mexicano or Chicano. And then just looking at the case itself, kind of some analysis that I did looking at how I look at both parties are at fault with the situation. The political system is at fault. What are the dilemmas in terms of our community and what can we do? Why is it that there continues to be, if not worsening, educational, social, economic, and political struggles? And then, unfortunately, my father died, at the age of 40, in 1985 after giving testimony, and the court went to case. The case went to court, and how my father was impacted by the Vietnam War and it took his life. I don't have proof, but I'm pretty sure that that's what it was: post-traumatic stress disorder, TBI, exposure to Agent Orange. And then again, just some recommendations in the way I look at these things. And this is a picture of my brother and I and his family and my mother. And the important thing for me about this conference is this quote by Christopher Lasch in his book, The True and Only Heaven. One day he said, he in a Birmingham letter, MLK, the South will recognize its real heroes, the disinherited children of God, who are standing up for what was best in the American dream. And so this is what it is. This is what this conference is about, is going back to MLK's Birmingham letter and recognizing people. Thank you.
Rather than waiting for questions at the end, I think I'd like to go ahead and take a minute here since it's fresh on our minds and go ahead and open up the floor to questions since he's just a presentation. Anyone have any questions for Joseph? Yes.
So in '85, your father put together a slate of candidates for the city council?
No, in '84, school board.
School board, okay. And they were successful?
Yes. They overturned a pretty much all white school board.
And how did that change things?
Well, it gave them a victory that kind of gave them hope and the opportunity to challenge the situation, as well as inherent different things that were going on in the school district. In terms of one of the speakers was saying, is that there's still preferential treatment given to certain students, or white students. I remember that also. And to a certain extent, there was, up until the mid-'80s, kind of segregated elementary. There's an elementary in the Chicano part of town that has this little sliver of being part of the city, we call it the city limits, but yet this whole area of barrio isn't connected. And so you had, it was mostly Chicano students or Mexicano students going to that elementary, where you also had a white elementary, or mostly white elementary.
Yes, Dr. Fletcher.
I was looking, when you put the map up, it had District 1, District 2, and then you had that part that's outside the 2 districts,
Yes.
and they're completely unrepresented?
Do you want
to Yes.
comment, Joseph?
And you haven't reseen? I mean, how can a part of the city have no representation at all?
It's not part of the city.
Yeah, it's not accepted into the limits.
Oh, I thought you said it was.
No. It was at one time, and then it's gone back to not being recognized.
So the south side of town, I'm Joseph.
Oh,
The south side of town.
Co-presented.
For the Taft Ranch.
okay.
So they only incorporated certain parts of it, and they didn't incorporate certain parts of it to disenfranchise the voters, the registered voters.
That's a different take on gerrymandering.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's 100 years right there.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Fletcher.
So how did Taft originally get the land? You said this was the brother of the president,
Of Taft.
right? President Taft. Do you know the story?
Yeah, there's a book called
How he acquired the land and when was that? And kind of the politics of the moment,
Mhm.
right? And land dispossession and so on potentially.
Well, there's a book called The Mexican-American Frontier by Taylor, who was an economist or social economist. who wrote a book.
Sociologist in
Yeah,
North Carolina.
exactly. Who wrote the book on Nueces County and how a lot of those were originally Spanish land grants, Mexican land grants to families, and various ways they were taken. I mean, my sister-in-law's great-grandfather was killed in San Diego for his land. So that's the way a lot of that went down. I don't know specific to the lands in Taft, but I know through this book that looks at Nueces County, which borders San Patricio County.
There isn't a lore or a history as to how that happened in the community. I mean, known by the community, but folks in the community.
I'm sure there is. I'm not aware of it. I mean, before anybody was there was the Carancuas that were eliminated.
Yeah, so the ranch owner actually colonized Taft, if you will, and the Anglos lived in the north side, and the Hispanics or the Latinos in the south side. And the reason for the town was to support the ranch. That was the whole purpose. And there's a rail spur there, so that's where all the cattle and all the crops were traversed back and forth to market.
Any other questions? I had a question. One of the things I find incredibly fascinating about this is that you actually studied your own family. And I wondered if you could share, what are some of the challenges? I mean, all families have secrets. Was there a point where you thought, I don't want to know? Or, how do you maintain sort of that neutral, scholarly mask when you're really talking about something that's so intimate to you?
Well, I don't know if I'm neutral at all. But, I mean, my mother's been pretty blunt with us growing up and pretty honest with, the challenges we faced and my dad's, troubles from Vietnam and things of that nature. And so that's kind of the way I approach life, being pretty as honest as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're going to move on. Big round of applause. Next, we're going to have a presentation from a paper co-authored by Luis Ricardo Fraga, who most of you all know. Dr. Fraga is a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, and he's co-authored with Vicky Ibarra, who is a senior fellow at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Center for Health Policy. So join me in welcoming Vicky.
I'll rely on my co-author, Professor Fraga, here to answer any questions that come up today, especially the hard ones. So I'm pleased to be with you today. I've never spent much time in Texas. It's great to be here and to meet the friendly Texas people. I bring you greetings today from the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, where, yes, we do have Latinos in Washington State, and more importantly, the Voting Rights Act is very important to helping ensure Latino political engagement even in this day and age. So this story comes from Yakima, Washington, beautiful Yakima Valley in central Washington State. Yakima County is the top producer of some of the crops you consume and are consumed all over the country, top producer of apples and hops in the country. Also a major producer of sweet cherries, wine grapes. I think this is wine grapes here we're seeing. And other tree fruit, all of which require intensive hand cultivation and harvesting, always have. And so this community has a long history of Mexican migration for the purpose of farm work, and that's the community we'll be talking about today. In the interest of full disclosure, this is a community where I lived and worked for 21 years prior to moving to Albuquerque to pursue my doctoral studies. It's a community where I raised my children. It's a community I know well and I love. And so maintaining that professional space you talked about is interesting, right? Move that up just a little bit if you can. I'm sorry, I didn't copy this correctly. So Yakima County and the Yakima Valley are located in central Washington State. As I mentioned, Mexican farm workers have migrated to the valley since the early 1900s, drawn by labor-intensive crops. The egg industry greatly expanded after World War II in Yakima, as it did in other places around the country after the completion of major federal works irrigation projects. And I've got a chart here, 1970 to 2010, showing the growth of the Hispanic population both in the county, the bottom row, and in the city of Yakima. City of Yakima is the county seat and the largest city in the county at about 93,000 people right now. Immigration reform was also a major factor in the growth of the Hispanic population. We see in 1990 a big jump from the 1980 census in Hispanic populations, and it's just continued to grow since then. So the community still has a large population of older immigrant farm workers who are almost all settled out now. The migrant stream changed, and so while many people are still farm workers, they are seasonal workers, no longer migrant workers for the most part, settled out, and then their children who have taken over the schools. Right? So this is the site of our study. Because of the dependence of immigrant and migrant labor, the exclusionary relationship between the white power structure in the community and Mexican migrant farm workers is really rooted, that contentious relationship is really rooted in the relationship between labor and workers, and we see that tension moving forward even today. Oh, no, I'm okay. All right, so in 2012, the ACLU filed a suit against the city of Yakima for Latino voter disenfranchisement after a couple of years of trying to get the city to move to districted elections. There was activity on the part of activists, there was activity on the part of outside groups investing money for a petition, trying to get the city council to district their elections. Although the city is over 40% Latino, there had never been a Latino elected to city council. In 2009, there was a very qualified attorney who had been elected, who had been appointed, and when she tried to run for re-election as an incumbent, was not able to win in a citywide election. So all of the seats had to be voted on in the general election as citywide. Prior to the ACLU decision, there were districts that were voted on in the primary, but in the general election, any candidate had to win the entire city in order to win. Thus, no Latinos had ever been elected. So in 2012, the ACLU filed suit under Section 2 on behalf of 2 local Mexican-American residents. And in 2014, the trial was set for fall of 2014, and in August of 2014, Judge Thomas Rice from the Eastern District in Washington State, federal judge from the Eastern District in Washington State, issued a summary judgment, a summary judgment saying that the city had violated Section 2, finding that the city had violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This is a quote from his judgment in 2014. In the final analysis, there's only one rational conclusion to be drawn, that the non-Latino majority in Yakima routinely suffocates the voting preferences of the Latino should be minority. Judge Rice's ruling overturned the city's longstanding at-large hybrid election system, and in a subsequent ruling, the judge ordered that the city adopt the ACLU's proposed 7-district system, 7-district map, and ordered new elections to be held in 2015. So it went really quick. There'd been a lot leading up to the trial, but once the order happened, it went really quick. And this was the first Section 2 vote dilution case ruling in the Pacific Northwest. This is the new map. Could you scroll that down just a little bit? This is the new map of the city districts. This was submitted by the ACLU in the case, and this is the map that the judge ordered. The 2 districts in East Yakima, 1 and 2, are both Latino majority districts. That was new. Of the 7, after the ruling, of the 7 sitting city council members, only 3 chose to run for re-election in districts 4, 5, and 6, non-Latino incumbent city council persons. All the other districts were open and up. This is from the ACLU documents that they submitted to the court. This is their analysis of Latino CVAP citizen voting age population in each of the districts. So we see that District 1 is the only district that has majority Latino citizen voting age population, but District 2 is very close behind at 45%, and then we go down from there. So it was thought that Districts 1 and 2 were the greatest opportunity to elect a Latino city council person, but Districts 3 and 4 were thought to be Latino influenced. There are still quite a few potential Latino voters in those districts. So our research question, Professor Fraga and I, as we approached this study, was simply to what extent has the VRA decision in the city of Yakima in 2014 impacted Latino political incorporation? And admittedly, there hasn't been a lot of time left to pass. Often when these studies are done, we have lots of time and lots of data to look at. So we have a very short period of time. But even examining just data that's come mostly out of the primary election, we see evidence of increased Latino political incorporation associated with this decision. For our organizing framework, we use Fraga and Ramirez's conceptualization of political incorporation, multidimensional, that looks at political incorporation along these three descriptive dimensions: electoral influence, representation, and policy benefit, and then also along these analytic dimensions of access, opportunity, and institutionalization that we can think of as a continuum of political incorporation along each of the descriptive dimensions. We collected a lot of data, even from just the primaries, so I think in the interest of time, I'm going to share just a bit of that with you, looking again specifically at electoral influence, representation, and policy benefit. This is the number of Latinos filing. So we went back and looked at the history just to see, was the lawsuit bringing Latinos into the electoral system, and there's definitely evidence of that. Under the old system, from 1979 to 2013, there were only a total of 7 Latinos who ever filed to run for city council in the city, for a total of 61 positions. But in 2015, we see 8 Latinos filed for a total of 7 positions. So even just in that short period of time, you see Latinos who finally think maybe there is an opportunity to be elected, and people are filing for the first time. Not shown here, we also see evidence of increased competition across the city, not just in those 2 Latino majority districts, but the competition is driven by this increase in Latino filings. See, although most of Latinos filed in districts 1 and 2, not all of them did. So I think the calculation we did showed that under this old system, about half of the seats drew more than 2 candidates. But in 2015, most of the seats, all but 1 seat, drew more than 2 candidates. So increased competition across the city for these seats. 5 of the 8 Spanish surname candidates made it through the primary and in the 4 districts where they ran. Go back, I went way too far. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. So when we submitted the paper, we didn't have access to the general election. The general elections now happen. We don't have access to the data yet. I'll share the results with you. But the data we have to examine from the voting files was from the primary election. We'll do the same analysis with the general election data, but for right now, I'm just going to share with you the primary election. We do see evidence here in terms of electoral influence of greater participation on the part of Latino potential registered voters and registered voters. So we measured 3 dimensions here. We looked at, or 3 factors. We looked at the number of Spanish surname voters who were registered, comparing the 2015 primary to the 2013 primary. And we see here an increase citywide, and I just have to make a small disclaimer. It's citywide, but we didn't include District 7 because 7 didn't have a primary in 2015. We're able to compare to 2013 because there were 2 citywide elected, citywide positions, and so we have citywide voters voting in 2013 as well. But from the primary in 2013 to the primary in 2015, we see an increase in Spanish surname registered voters. We see a slight decrease in non-Spanish surname registered voters across the city. This effect was concentrated in districts 1 and 2, as we might expect, the new majority Latino districts. Spanish surname voters, 1,200 registered to 1,300 registered, 1,600 registered to 1,700 registered. So there were registration campaigns in those districts. The other number I want to share with you is the turnout number. So we do see citywide an increase in turnout among those registered for Spanish surname voters. So among those registered in 2013, the turnout citywide for Spanish surname voters was just over 10% of those registered. It went up to over 13% of those registered. And as expected, those effects are seen primarily in districts 1 and 2. Districts 1 and 2 are very poor. These are, especially District 1, very poor communities. And so the turnout among registered voters is low compared to non-Spanish speaking, and the registration level of voters, of those who are eligible, is low, as we might expect in very low-income communities. But we do see an increase in that turnout number both in Districts 1 and 2. We also see some increase in some of the other districts as well, not uniformly. Interestingly, we did not expect it, but it does appear as though the non-Spanish surname vote on all of those measures, registration, turnout, and votes cast, is a little suppressed throughout the community. So it did not go up, it went down from 2013. We'll do the same analysis with the general election. I expect to see similar findings. Okay. In terms of representation, last week we had an election. And Friday, there was finally a headline in the paper. They waited because District 3's race was too close to call. But this is our new city council. Hard to see, but those first 3 faces there are Latinas, young Latinas, under 40, each one. So for the first time in Yakima, we have our first Latinos ever elected to city council. We also have our first majority female council. Never in the history of the city has there been a majority female council. And although Latinas were not the only Hispanics to run, they were the only ones elected. So these are all women. And Jose Angel, you recognize one of them, I'm sure, yes, is number 2. Avina is here in number 2. Not a great picture. You can't see her very well, but she's there. I think it also, I haven't calculated the average age, but this really brought down the average age on council as well. So as with many city councils, most of the incumbents, and all 3 incumbents ran, all the incumbents were over 60, over 70 years old. So the average age probably has come down to a record as well. This is our new city council. Nobody's quite figured it out yet. The paper didn't talk about it, but I'm sure they will. This is also our first majority progressive council. In a very politically conservative community. Okay. So remember that third descriptive dimension was policy. The city council hasn't had a chance to start to make policy yet. The new council isn't seated. They haven't made policy, so we can't examine that yet. But we do have from the primary and from the general elections some of what we're calling sort of proto or pre-policy activity. There has been a lot of this sort of community engagement forums, lots of opportunity to discuss issues that are of concern to voters all over the city. And I've brought just 2 examples here today. This is a poster from the May 30th Civic Engagement Conference, co-sponsored by the State Commission on Hispanic Affairs and the local student MECHA group. It was held at the community college. There were about 200 attendees. They did it bilingually, focusing on getting Latinos in. It was really a wonderful opportunity to not only learn about civic engagement, but for the community to be educated on issues of concern. It was also, early in the primary campaign, the first opportunity for most of the primary candidates to be in one place and to sort of have to talk about issues that were of concern to the voters. It was really unprecedented in Yakima. We haven't seen anything like that before as concerns city council. And then the other example I've brought is a June rally that also was history-making in the community. So the city council, after the federal judge's ruling, had said all along that they would not seek to stop the elections in 2015. And then at an early June meeting, in an item that was not on the agenda, they voted and decided to try to stay the election. They filed in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to try to stay the election. It was a surprise. They had said they weren't going to do it. It wasn't on the agenda, so no one could show up and speak against it, but they did it. And it brought a lot of concern on the part of the community. So there was a large rally that was organized by 13 local groups. There was a large rally. It was held in the park across the street from City Council. There were speakers. We see here one of the black ministers in town speaking. It was a multiracial group that spoke about the importance of voting rights and civil rights. The black ministers in town have been great. They've lent their voice to this and are speaking in terms of civil rights and the black civil rights movement. And then this group, a lot of this group walked across to the city council chambers, camped out, made them put in chairs in places there had never been chairs before in city council, and gave testimony for 3 hours about how the council should withdraw its request for a stay. The council chose not to withdraw the request for a stay, and 3 days later, the Ninth Circuit rejected the request. So the elections went forward. But I use these as examples of some of the community activity that we're seeing. Existing groups that are now focusing on issues in town, new groups that have grown up, and new money and resources that are coming into the community for policy work as well as for electoral work, investments from the west side of the mountains especially, investment in the community to see this civic engagement happen. And also in terms of policy, I'll just mention there's been increased opportunity to talk about the issues of concern to the poorer Latino neighborhoods. Those candidates ran on basic issues, basic city services, streets, streetlights, sidewalks, public safety, and parks. Those were their big issues because that's what their community was telling them they were concerned about. So these issues not only got play in those elections for those 2 seats, those issues were elevated citywide in citywide forums where all city council persons had to talk about these issues. There was recently a decision by the city council, the existing city council, to build a new pool in town. And so that brought up discussions of the old East Side pool that was closed in 2005 in one of the poorest neighborhoods in town. And that, the new pool certainly isn't going to be built in the east side of town. So it brought up those discussions. One of the candidates, her team was witness to the aftermath of a fatal stabbing in the same park. The team came upon the homeless man who'd been stabbed and later died and had to deal with that. So that brought all these issues of basic services and public safety, brought all these issues up into the community to talk about. So in summary, I'll just say we find evidence that the federal VRA has been instrumental in opening up the opportunity structure for Latinos in this community, in this relatively new destination community. We find evidence most strongly in electoral opportunities and least strongly in policy, although as we see the City Council make policy, we believe there's opportunity for more. In the future, to finish out this work or to take it to its next level, we hope to finish the analysis of the general election after the election is certified in a couple of weeks to determine whether Latinos voted as a block, if there's polarized voting, and we have an opportunity to do that in districts 2 and 3 where we had a Latino running against non-Latino, collect data on policy outcomes in the new council as it works, and then consider additional questions. I'm especially interested in this idea of the multiracial civic engagement. There does appear to be scaffolding happening with the older, better organized, but very small African American community who's lending their voice to this issue. Now we have a Filipino group coming up from the lower part of the community, so there does seem to be some multiracial scaffolding, so we're interested in looking at that as well. And that, I think, yes, is all I have. Okay, thank you.
Are there any questions for Vicki or Dr. Clara? Yes, Dr. Manning?
I have a question. So 3 young women. So that's great. I wonder if why it would be that more young women are running now as opposed to older people, one. And the other thing is, more of the young men.
So I guess I would start with saying there's young men are running too. There were 3 or 4 or 5 who were in the pool and ran and didn't get. These young women are prepared for leadership. They've all had experiences that prepare them for leadership, and they have support. I would say too, among a white electorate, that Latinos are more threatening than Latinas are. Latinas can make inroads that men just aren't able to. That's my observation. Luis, would you say anything else about that?
I mean, there's a way that one can understand Latinas as being able to, it's a term that I and some co-authors use, soften their ethnicity by being perceived by potential voters as both women and ethnics, whereas the man is perceived just as an ethnic. And that it opens up an additional set of what I call strategic opportunities that the Latinas can choose to pursue in the electoral process that might broaden their coalition support. If we had gender-based data to see if that worked better with male voters rather than female, we don't have the gender data, right? We could do a survey, but it's unlikely to happen, right? Because it would be unreliable. But you know, it's possible that one might see differences along those lines. Was it, you know, more women voters that turned out generally, that supported the female candidates and so forth? So there are a variety of things going on here. What I think we're seeing in this election is a general pattern that we see, which is that young Latina women tend to be more active in leadership positions all across the board. Community-based organizations, formal leadership positions, and now finally in formally elected positions, which was usually the glass ceiling that many Latina candidates experienced.
Any other questions? Yes.
Vicki, what are the other challenges in Yakima County? What's next on the horizon after this?
The
incredible
15th
success
district, the new, so as this was happening, one of the reasons I think this happened, there were opportunities after the 2010 census, the redistricting process for state legislative seats established the first Latino majority, our first in the state, Latino majority state legislative district in the lower county. Part of it reaches up into the city of Yakima, but mostly in the lower county, encompassing the Indian Reservation and other majority Latino communities. So I think that community still needs a voice, has still not elected their candidate of choice yet.
Will that need to have some tinkering with the district boundaries, perhaps incorporate some of these new empowered parts of Yakima?
1 and 2 are in the
Already in the
15th.
15th?
Right. So I think it's okay. I think what's happened and what I hear strategy-wise from some of the West Side groups is that this laid some foundation that may be opportunity later. And then it's still, the other big challenge I'd say, Matt, is it's still to be seen whether they can get policy passed that benefits their community, right? We'll see.
As well as other cities in Yakima County too, right? Have these same challenges.
Well, most of the smaller cities in the lower valley already have Latinos on city councils and school boards because they've been majority Latino for a very long time. And they're very low resource communities, right?
Very low resource.
Very low resource communities, yeah. So Yakima was sort of the last bastion.
There's a question over here.
Have you seen any counter reaction? I realize it's early, but has there been any, you had the Section 2 lawsuit, but are there any efforts to slip in voting requirements or anything that would?
We haven't seen anything yet. I would say there's backlash, certainly backlash in the community, in the white community.
Backlash like local?
Yes, one of the city council current city council members, bless you, who did not choose to run again, is a very prominent conservative talk show host on a local talk show, and so he used city council as a way to sort of feed his radio station, and lots of ugly, I would say, racist things said on that station. We also saw backlash after the rally. 2 or 3 city council people, including some who were reelected, were very threatened by the rally, said they felt bullied, victims of all of these people coming to talk to them. So there was certainly that verbal concern about what was happening that was out in the public community.
But nothing at even like the state level, anything that it's trickled up or anything?
No, there's been an effort in the state legislature to pass a State Voting Rights Act for 3 or 4 years, and that is stalled. They're using Yakima as the poster child for that. Whether what's happened actually helps or might hurt that effort remains to be seen.
There's a question from Dr. Gutierrez.
Not a question, just an update. One of the very sophisticated moves occurring is who's going to be mayor.
Yep.
So the white females are asking the Chicana females, including my daughter, whether they want to be mayors. The Chicanas are trying to recruit the only white guy remaining to be the mayor. Because you can just think a little bit more. If you're the mayor, you're going to be compromised in trying to get, the thing to work, which means you can't be effective otherwise. And on the other side, if you become mayor, you can't represent your district anymore. So it's interesting movidas, and that, to me, that's a counter reaction. These whites are thinking, how can we screw this up if it's inevitable?
Jim Estrada had a question.
Yeah, I guess my question was going to be along that line, strategies, next steps. And part of my concern would be sort of a letdown on the part of the community. We've had these victories, podemos descansar, okay? As opposed to, how do you take that momentum of that win and start injecting that optimism and that victorious sense into the rest of the community, particularly with this district-wide, the state rep position or district that's being contested shortly. How do you take all that energy? Or what are the next steps of taking all that energy of this recent victory to move that political process along?
I think you're right that there is a lot of expectation. The community is on a real high right now, right? You listen to Spanish language radio, read Spanish language press, listen to the community that work. There's a lot of celebrating happening right now. But there are no institutions in the community to carry this work forward. All of the investment that happened was on the part of the campaigns themselves, bringing resources in and doing the work themselves in those districts, and from outside groups from the Seattle area that had money and were investing in organizing in the community. There are no local organizations to do that are Latino-based. The community's been oppressed for too long. There's some good people doing good work, but there are no institutions. And whether those institutions can be built in order to carry that work on, it's an open question.
Is there a question back there? No? No question. Any other question? Yes.
You answered the first one, I was going to ask where the money came from. So I'll ask a tougher one. So you've got an interesting vantage point because you go back and forth from Yakima to New Mexico, and Yakima's, in my view, demographically at least, like a small New Mexico.
Yep, that's what I've always said.
Have you,
It's actually a smaller Texas. Literally a smaller Texas.
but have you gained any insights given that New Mexico's got by far the most Hispanic representation, not so much policy responsiveness and outcomes? Here, how do you do better than we do?
So you and I've talked about this issue in New Mexico before. My view, apart from traditional New Mexico politics, New Mexico has no resources, right? There's no public resources. There's very little in the way of public resources. When I compare the two states and think of how rich we are in Washington in terms of investing in human services, in healthcare, it's because of the tax base, right? Yakima is a poor community, so there'll be relatively poor resources, but the city has way more resources than any place else in the county, and the city has resources to give. The newest pool they want to build is a good example. So the city fathers found money and found a public-private partnership to build this wonderful new aquatic center they want to build in the west side of town, where we make sure no Mexican kids are going to have access to it, but they found the money to do that. There's resources there. It's a matter of where are we allocating. One of the things that this election did bring up, and the whole pool issue brought up, was the issue of equity in parks. Professor Fraga wrote an expert an expert report for the ACLU lawsuit, and one of the issues he examined specifically was equity in parks. So when the pool issue came up, we got that released to the public with his permission, with ACLU's permission, so that the newspaper and the public had the data. There is inequity in parks, because if you bring it to any of the city council members, they say, no, there's no inequity in parks. Those workers work really hard to keep those east side parks clean. So we're all the same. No, we're not the same. So it's a matter of how they're allocated. We'll see what happens. Yes.
When you're saying there's no institutions in Yakima, I guess I'm just curious. I'm regressing a little bit, but I spent time in Yakima in the early years of the '70s, helping them build migrant community health centers. Mm-hmm. And I know that they've come a long way with that, and I'm wondering whether those institutions, because they were very organizing, activist-based, and we dealt with all the racism that existed in Yakima without to get them established. Whether out of those institutions, in this case, the example, it's a healthcare institution, whether if any of those folks are actively engaged or could be a vehicle for some of that.
So I'd say the short answer is no. There was probably more activism when you were there in terms of institutions. The Community Migrant Health Center is where I worked for 21 years, and I helped expand it to be this huge institution. The nonprofits, and there's a national literature on this, right? The nonprofits have been depoliticized through the tax code and through other mechanisms. Those folks are afraid to do organizing.
Yeah.
They stay away from it because they don't need their funding messed with, and there are threats against funding.
Sounds like Texas.
But there's still some of those people doing that work, and those individuals are doing good
We'll
things.
take one last question. Here in the back.
So real quickly, your pool example, when Joseph and I grew up in Taft, there was a city-built pool that
You told me this
Latinos weren't allowed in. So, but I will point out that I think that one of the keys for me takeaways is the alliances with the other minority groups. That was key to my father's strategy. He
Was it?
reached out to Anglos that he thought would support, and definitely the African-American, small African-American community in our town. And he actually had one of the plaintiffs on the lawsuit was one of the African-American leaders in the town, so very key, I think.
Thank you. Swimming pool story is something I need to follow up on. Everyone's got a swimming pool story, right? But it's not in the literature.
Yep.
So somebody needs to do a study. It's on the
Dr. Bell,
list.
we'll let you round out the last
So
question.
how is the Catholic Church involved or not involved in these sorts of movements?
It varies by parish, right? I do know that the organizer that ACOU hired in town leading up to the general election worked closely with one Spanish-speaking priest who was very active in encouraging people to vote, encouraging them to register, things like that. But that's an exception, I would say, rather than a rule.
The traditional alliance of the Catholic Church in Yakima, the fund, they provide the money. They provide the large donation.
Right, just
You
like
get a
during-
very interesting bifurcation. And the Archdiocese of Yakima was, the bishop of the Archdiocese of Yakima was actually my father-in-law's first cousin, Chicano from San Francisco.
Bishop Sevilla.
Bishop Sevilla, who was known for being, shall we say, quite middle of the road, and was put in that position in part.
It's a similar dynamic just during the farm workers' struggles in the Central Valley, but similar kinds of issues.
Yeah.
But he would be the bishop, not the archbishop. So the metropolitan would be the archbishop of Seattle, I would think. So maybe.
No, the Archbishop of Seattle has no jurisdiction over Yakima. The Archbishop doesn't govern over the bishop, it's just the Archbishop of Seattle. Yakima is a separate diocese.
Right, but he's still the metropolitan for the local area, so that region, the way that the church divides these things. So there would still be sort of a relationship as the metropolitan.
No, not at all. They're separate. One's called an archdiocese, one's a diocese, but there's no jurisdiction.
All right, let me just, Roman pause, we will. So when we talk politics and religion, it just goes crazy. And before we get on to our last speaker, I do want to make a shameless plug. A lot of great things are being said here today. Let's not let it stay in the room. Let's tweet, let's hashtag, oftentimes we're just talking amongst ourselves. So let's share these messages. Please tweet. On page 4 in the program is the hashtag. So tweet, hazle por Facebook, ponte los Googles. Let's get this out there so that we can get the word out about what we do and what we're passionate about. So our final presenter, it's actually a dual paper written by Vinicio Cinta here and Lourdes Cueva Chacon. They'll be presenting. I'm really interested in this. This is looking at the news after a city's redistricting.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We are students from the School of Journalism. We're working on our PhDs. This is a study of media, specifically a newspaper here in Austin, and we're looking at it from the point of view of the production of media, which is also called media sociology. And there's no we don't look at it from the political science point of view, for example, but we do look at it from the point of view of the basic tenets of journalism that say that a well-informed community is a community that can make very good decisions and can enact change and improve their situation. So our interest when doing this study was to see if news in or the media in the city was actually living up to those goals. And so we changed the title a little bit from what you see in the program, but the spirit of the paper is the same. So it's the news after redistricting its effects of shift in political geography on electoral coverage. And so, as a brief introduction,
Oh, where's our,
okay. Maybe I don't know how to use this. Okay.
the one on the right?
There you go. In 2012, there was a proposal that passed in the election in November 2012. And so it was approved to change the way the council was elected. And instead of being at large, we changed to 10 districts. It was a very important change in the way the city would elect their representatives. And it was after several attempts, most of them by voting, not by lawsuits. And it was actually the 7th attempt that was tried. The city was divided in 10 districts. And there were 4 districts that were considered or called the minority opportunity districts, and there are the ones on the east side of the city is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Number 1 was the African American Opportunity District, and the other 3 were called the Latino Opportunity Districts. And these can give you an idea of how the city had been segregated for a long time. And so the idea was to give representation to the citizens of the communities. So what we did was we used theory within media studies that say that not only it's not only who buy the paper or who pay for the advertisement in the paper who decides or influence the content of what's published in the paper. So there are 2 theoretical concepts that we use. One is a community structure approach, and the other is a geoethnic context. And both are related to the demographics of the area. So how the community is structured, who belong to the community, what's the ethnic, what are the ethnic components of the community. Those are also big influence on what the news are published on newspapers. And so based on these 2, we wanted to see if the big change that happened in the city was also reflected on how the media in the city will cover different things related to the community. So what we did, we had these questions, right? And so what was the visibility of public issues? Were the same issues covered before the change and after the change, or not? Was there a change? There was more detailed on the demographics of the population that were part of the news. There was more detail about the geographic specificity of the issues, and what was the coverage of the candidates and how the sources were used. Also, if there was a difference in between before and after. So what we did is called a content analysis. We collected the stories, and we only work with the Austin American Statesman. There are several reasons for that. One is a reason of resources. It's just the two of us. The other reason is because mainstream media, and the statement can be considered as the mainstream media, is the one that are more criticized for the content of the news, and they don't care that much about the whole community, right? And because alternative media and ethnic media are already pursuing the benefit of specific communities, with mainstream media who is usually criticized for not doing that.
Did you include ONC as part of the Austin?
No, it was just the Austin version, yes. Mm-hmm. And this is an exploratory study. At the end of the presentation, I'll tell more about what we're planning to do. with this study. And so what we did, we collected stories from the elections in 2011 and 2012, which were the two previous elections before the change, and we had to do this because putting those years together, we had the whole city council replaced because the elections were staggered before. And then we collected the news about the election in 2012. And so you can see that we got 89 stories for the first one and 149 stories on the second one. And so just looking at that, you can see that there's a difference. There's more stories on the second time. The variables that we were trying to look into to see that it was changed with the issues that the newspaper covered, the geographic specificity and representation, the candidates, and the sources used for the news. So in the results, we could see a marked decrease in economic investment and utilities. So in order to be able to see if there was a difference of no, we had variables, we read all the stories and we coded them. And we based the type of stories on previous research that have established what are the main issues that the newspapers cover. So, for example, in terms of economic investment and utilities I think it's easier to understand. But in terms of economic investment, before the change, a lot of the stories were focused on businesses that were coming to town and how the city council was deciding what incentives to give to them. So this Apple, for example, or other companies that will bring jobs to the city. So, and it would look as a benefit for the whole city. So after the change, those type of stories show a decrease. And then there was an increase on the stories related to education, traffic and safety, and affordability. So there are more stories that talk about specific places in the city that have problems with traffic or public safety, or for example, parks is another topic that we didn't see before. So there are issues like, for example, the park in this area doesn't have these other amenities that should have, or this neighborhood cannot really access this park because in order to get there, that you have to cross a highway and there's no way to do it safely. And so there were more stories of that type. And this is it's not all of the variables, but you can see that there's a little bit of an increase in neighbor specificity, which means that they mention actual neighbors on the stories. And there's demographic specificity. That means that they talk about what's the ethnic composition of the district. So if there are more Latinos, the newspaper actually did a series of stories where they would explain what was the composition, the demographic composition of the district, and a little bit of history of how that had changed now along decades. And then there was more talk about representation also. So when they were talking about candidates or other issues, they would mention things like that there was, for example, this was going to be the first time there was going to be a representative that lives south of the river, the lake, because before all the people elected had lived either in the affluent areas of the city or in downtown. And so those type of topics were more prevalent. There was more talk about representation. Also women, for example, Latinas. In terms of the coverage of candidates, the incumbents still had more space, more space in the stories. And also they talked about the central city candidates were also had more space in the stories. District 9 is a district the most important district in the city, at the center of the city, and had more coverage. But there was also coverage of the minority opportunity districts, and District 4 was the one that was more notably covered. I don't remember. Is that because of the brothers and the siblings?
No, District 4 was the Laura Presley and Greg Casar.
Oh,
So it
okay.
was-
Yeah, this was a little bit of an anecdotal view. So these were the issues. In terms of sources, we can also see a change. In this case, the change is not dramatic, but you can still see that, for example, in terms of candidates, there are more coverage of candidates. And in this case, it's also arguably that there were more candidates to interview. We had about 78 candidates for the 10 districts, so it was a big change. Before it was just, I think 5 would be the most, and it was just only 2 or 3 places that were voted, and so that was a significant less number of candidates. There was a decrease in the government sources. That means officials, people from the city, or people from any other type of government offices. But that meant that NGOs and unaffiliated, just common people, had more time, more space in the storage too. And there was also a decrease in businesses' sources. And the conclusion would be that there was change, and that it's very interesting for us. That means that the community really, the structure of the community really can influence the content of media, and can force the media to direct the attention. Then there were more attention to difference and to demographic trends also, and we think that it's very interesting. And in terms of opportunities for future research, we only cover the Austin American statement, but we would like to also do TV. The way TV covers campaigns and elections is a little bit different, but it's also interesting. It's a little bit more difficult to have access to that type of information for us as our researchers. But so what we would like to do is interview journalists and editors to understand how the change influenced their work. If there was things that they would like to have done better, but they couldn't, and what was the limitations of, obviously, resources in newspapers and TV are a big problem. A lot of news outlets are downsizing, and so we can understand that there's a huge effort also behind that, but there might be other things that we can uncover with the study. And we also want to be able to see if we compare this change here in Austin, it's the same as in places like Seattle and Yakima, who also have recently changed from elections at large to district based. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Lourdes and Vinicio? Any questions?
I'm really sorry that State Senator Barrientos was here before at the beginning of the meeting, but apparently to another room. He was the president of the...
He was the chair of the redistricting
chair.
committee, so
So he could have told us a little bit more about history, because there's an interesting history in
behind the process
Yeah.
itself, behind
Why?
the redistricting process itself.
why Austin took so long to change from at-large to districts. Yes.
Prior to going to 10-1, there were 7 times we could have
Yes.
voted on it. And we turned it up. And not just Anglo, the Anglo, but the community at large.
Yes.
So.
Do you know why that
never
is?
got the vote.
Do you know why that is?
No, unfortunately, I don't know. I think that people were just afraid, or Latinos, or people of color just don't go out to vote as much as they should.
The other thing is that The other thing that we didn't cover in our study, but it's interesting, is that a lot of the stories were also dedicated to inform the public about what the change actually involved. So I don't think that effort was previously put in the newspaper to explain what the voting was about and what the changes could have meant for the population.
The same thing happened with affordable housing. Same thing, seven or eight times.
Voting
Yeah.
on it,
Yeah, voting.
don't pass it.
But it always shows up.
Is there a question in the back?
Lourdes, are you making that assumption based on what you have seen in the previous stories of the past 7 efforts, or is that something you're just pointing out there?
It's based on a study that another classmate from our school did. He did the same study comparing the before and after, but he focused on the framing of the campaigns and how the paper had framed the campaigns, and one of them was literacy. And so there was a larger number of stories oriented to inform the community about the change than on the previous.
So I'm kind of confused. Has there been analysis of the news coverage of the previous 7 times that the city's tried?
Oh, no, not saying that. Just the previous election against the 2014 election.
Well, I think that'd be really interesting to see how the coverage of the previous redistricting changed.
And the title could be "The 8th Time is the Charm."
There you go. The 7th, yeah.
That's very good.
Are there any other questions? Well, I would be remiss if I did not recognize Dr. Charlie Cottrell, who walked in the room. Dr. Cottrell, it's such an honor to have you with us this afternoon. As I think back about these presentations we've heard this afternoon, I can't help but be struck by a few things. Number one, maps matter. Maps matter. And I'll do a shameless plug for Dr. Flores, who studies redistricting, and he'll be speaking at another session here this afternoon. But maps matter. They really matter. Secondly, that Latinas are a growing block of political representatives. And that's something actually that we've seen developing over the years. It's not a new phenomenon. I think if you look at the data, it's something that we've recognized that Latinas are running for office and winning. And so that's very interesting. And lastly, I'm actually quite hopeful and inspired. I feel like, things aren't moving as fast as we kind of all want them to, but it certainly thinks, the stories and what we're hearing in Washington does make me feel like, at least in terms of Latino empowerment, that we are moving in the right direction. So the great work that Dr. Gutierrez and Dr. Cottrell and Dr. Flores have done, and so many other of you in the room, it hasn't been for naught. So we're slowly moving the train adelante. And so I just want to, again, join me in thanking the panel.
Just a quick comment on why the rise of the Latina. I don't know why this is a surprise to anyone. That's the future.
Yes.
Moynihan, way back when, focused, but wrongfully, but focused on the black woman, saying, why is she taking the leadership role? Where's the black guy? And all that literature. But since then on, white, black, brown, yellow, all those females outpace and out-attain their male counterparts. So I've been a college teacher forever. You see that in the classroom. You see that in the governance structure of student government. You see that in the clubs. You see it everywhere. The young women are stepping up to the plate. They're quicker, they're faster, they're more passionate. And this is not a new stereotype. I mean, they just care a lot more because they have a lot more investment in what they're doing. And the young guy is whipping out.
Well, yeah.
Early on.
Yeah. And I think it could be a reaction
gap,
to public policy, too. Is public policy being developed that is, what some could argue attacking women's health or women's issues, that also kind of ignites women to be more participatory in their politics, whether it be local or national. And that's very promising. I think that's a wonderful thing. Anything else? Yes.
Just a tag on. Several years ago, when I was with Anheuser-Busch, I used to give away their money philanthropically. And one of the groups that I gave money to after doing, let me first say, Anheuser-Busch does tremendous demographics. They can tell you what a left-handed, 5'7", brown-eyed man between 21 and 27, what kind of beer they'll buy, where they'll buy it, what time of the day they'll buy it. And demographically, they're one of the top marketing companies in the world. We found back then, this was in the 80s, that there was this surge occurring, this trend occurring where women were becoming more and more active, better educated, more serious, more cooperative than their male counterparts. That prompted me to give some money to the Hispanic Women's Network of Texas. Back in, Nora, what was that, 84? And that money that we invested in that organization, 13 cities throughout the state of Texas, has been paying dividends ever since, politically, socially, economically, in every way that you can think of. And I think it's, again, it's no surprise, should not come as a surprise that women politically are a heck of a lot more effective than than the male counterparts we've had in those places over the years. And I contend that trend will not stop soon.
And I'm going to tweet that.
I think
And with
that's a
that,
false
I
argument.
think we're excused. Thank you, everyone.